The lock clicked into place on the refrigerator door at exactly 9:47 p.m., and Marcus watched his stepfather pocket the key with the kind of casual cruelty that had become routine over the past decade. His stomach growled. Dinner had been 3 hours ago, and he'd been allowed exactly 4 forkfuls of pasta before Richard declared him ungrateful and sent him to his room. Now, standing in the dim kitchen in his worn pajama pants, Marcus wondered if this would be the night that finally broke him. But what Richard didn't know, what nobody in this cold, marble-tiled house knew, was that in exactly 2 hours and 13 minutes, Marcus would turn 25, and the trust fund his biological father had established before dying in a car accident would activate. $7 billion. The thought sat in his chest like a stone, heavy with the weight of everything about to change. The dining room chandelier cast expensive shadows across the mahogany table, the kind of lighting that made everything look like a magazine spread but felt nothing like home. Marcus had learned to eat quickly during family dinners, shoveling food before Richard found some new reason to criticize his table manners, his posture, his existence. Tonight's offense had been asking for seconds. "You think you deserve more?" Richard's voice had that particular edge that meant he was performing for Marcus's mother, Elena, who sat at the far end of the table pushing Caesar salad around her plate. "You contribute nothing to this household. Nothing. You're 24 years old, living under my roof, eating my food." Marcus had set down his fork carefully, the way you might set down a live grenade. "I work at the bookstore 6 days a week. I pay you rent." $300 a month, Richard laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut. "That doesn't even cover your water bill, the electricity you waste staying up all night reading those stupid books." His half-sister Vanessa, 13, and already fluent in her father's cruelty, had smirked from across the table. "Dad's right, you're basically a charity case." Elena had said nothing, and her silence had hurt more than Richard's words. Once, years ago, she had defended Marcus, back when his father had only been dead 3 years, and grief still gave her spine. Now she was a ghost in designer clothes, haunting her own house. The argument had escalated the way these things always did, Richard's voice rising with each perceived slight until he was standing, finger jabbing toward the stairs. "Get out of my sight. You don't get to sit at this table acting entitled when you're not even my real son. You're a beggar playing dress-up in clothes I bought." Marcus had climbed the stairs to his room, the smallest bedroom in the 7-bedroom house, the one that had been a storage closet before his mother married Richard 12 years ago. He'd sat on his bed, a hand-me-bound twin mattress that creaked with every movement, and waited. Waited for his stomach to stop growling, waited for the humiliation to fade, waited for midnight. At 9:30, hunger had driven him downstairs. The house was dark except for the under-cabinet lighting in the kitchen, that expensive blue glow that made everything look like an operating room. He'd opened the refrigerator carefully, wincing at the bright interior light, reaching for the leftover pasta container. That's when Richard had appeared in the doorway, still dressed in his business casual uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the logo of his moderately successful real estate firm. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm hungry." "You ate dinner?" "I had 4 bites." Richard had crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, pushed Marcus aside, not hard enough to leave a bruise, never hard enough to leave evidence, and pulled a key from his pocket. A bike lock key, the cheap brass kind you could buy at any hardware store. He'd threaded it through the refrigerator handle and the cabinet pull beside it, clicking it shut with theatrical precision. "There," Richard said, "problem solved. You want to eat my food? Earn it. Get a real job, move out, or keep being grateful I let you stay here at all." Now Marcus stood alone in the kitchen, the lock glinting in the blue light, and checked his phone. 10:02 p.m. 1 hour and 58 minutes until his birthday, until the lawyers his father's estate had retained arrived with documents Marcus had been forbidden from seeing until he turned 25, until everything Richard thought he knew about power dynamics in this house got rewritten. He walked back upstairs, each step deliberate, and sat at the small desk crammed into the corner of his room. His laptop, purchased with his own money from the bookstore job Richard loved to mock, glowed to life. He opened his email and reread the message that had arrived 3 months ago from Thornhill and Associates, the law firm that had managed his father's estate for the past 18 years. Dear Mr. Chen, per the terms of your late father David Chen's last will and testament, you are to present yourself at the address below on the date of your 25th birthday for the reading and activation of Trust Document 7B. Due to the sensitive and substantial nature of this trust, we will arrive at your current residence at 12:01 a.m. on December 10th to ensure proper legal transfer and documentation. Please do not discuss these arrangements with anyone prior to the designated date and time. Marcus had followed those instructions to the letter, even as Richard's cruelty had intensified over the past year, even as the locked refrigerator became a locked pantry, then locked cabinets, then a door alarm on Marcus's bedroom that Richard claimed was for security, but everyone knew was to monitor his movements. Even as his mother's silence grew louder, a presence that filled rooms without ever speaking his name. He pulled a duffel bag from under his bed and began packing. Not everything, that would raise suspicion if Richard did one of his random inspections, just the essentials. His father's watch, the one item Richard hadn't been able to confiscate because Marcus wore it every day. The photograph of his father holding him as a toddler, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. His grandfather's journal, written half in Mandarin, half in English, full of advice Marcus had absorbed like a second language. 3 changes of clothes, his passport. At 11:30, he heard Richard and Elena's bedroom door close. Vanessa's light had gone out an hour ago. She had school tomorrow, and whatever else Richard was, he was punctual about bedtimes for his biological child. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. The hum of the heating system, the creak of expensive floorboards, the whisper of wind against windows that cost more than most people's cars.
Marcus changed into jeans and a sweater, real clothes, instead of the pajamas Richard insisted he wear after 8 p.m., since you're not going anywhere anyway. He laced up his sneakers, the ones with the hole in the left toe that Richard refused to replace because you'll just ruin the new ones too. He checked his phone again, 11:47 p.m. He walked downstairs in the dark, muscle memory guiding him around the spots that creaked. The kitchen still glowed blue, the refrigerator still wore its humiliating lock. He took a photo of it with his phone, making sure the timestamp was visible. Evidence, though he wasn't sure yet what he'd need it for. At 11:55, headlights swept across the front windows. A town car, black and glossy, pulled into the circular driveway. Marcus opened the front door before they could knock. 2 people emerged, a woman in her 50s wearing a crisp suit despite the late hour, and a younger man carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than Marcus. "Mr. Chen," the woman said quietly, "I'm Patricia Thornhill. This is my associate, James Okonkwo. May we come in?" "My stepfather will be joining us momentarily," Patricia said, her smile professional and slightly sharp. "The trust terms require all current household heads to be present for the initial disclosure." Which explained why, at exactly midnight, the doorbell rang. Not a polite ring, but the kind of sustained press that said someone was leaning on the button. Upstairs, Richard's voice boomed. "What the hell?" Marcus opened the door wider as Richard thundered down the stairs, Elena trailing behind in her bathrobe, looking confused and frightened in the way she always did when routine shattered. Vanessa appeared on the landing, rubbing her eyes. "Who are you?" Richard demanded, positioning himself between the lawyers and Marcus as if protection was something he'd ever offered. "It's midnight. This is harassment." Patricia handed him a business card with the kind of calm that came from years of delivering life-changing news. "We're here on behalf of the estate of David Chen, deceased. His son has reached the age specified in Trust Document 7B, and we're here to execute the terms." Richard's face did something complicated. Confusion, then recognition, then a flash of fear he tried to hide behind bluster. "David Chen didn't have any money. He was a teacher. This is some kind of scam." "Mr. Chen was indeed an educator," James said, opening his briefcase. "He was also the primary heir to the Chen technology fortune, established by his grandfather in 1987. The estate has been managed by our firm for the past 18 years, as specified in Mr. Chen's will. The current valuation is approximately $7.2 billion. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Elena sat down on the stairs suddenly, her hand over her mouth. Vanessa's eyes went wide, doing math she wasn't old enough to understand. And Richard? Richard looked at Marcus the way you might look at a stranger who just walked out of your mirror.
"That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Patricia withdrew a document from James's briefcase, thick as a phone book, bound in blue leather. The terms are quite specific. Marcus David Chen receives full control of the trust at age 25, including all assets, properties, and investments managed therein. There are also provisions for, she glanced at Richard with something that might have been satisfaction, addressing any outstanding debts or grievances accumulated during the trust's dormancy. "What does that mean?" Elena's voice was small, barely audible. Patricia looked at Marcus, waiting. This was his moment, his choice. He could be generous, he could be kind, he could be the bigger person, the way his father's journal had always encouraged, the way his grandfather's advice had counseled patience and forgiveness. Instead, Marcus walked to the kitchen, these witnesses following, and took another photo of the locked refrigerator. Then he turned to Richard, pulled a folded paper from his pocket, he'd printed it last week, just in case, just hoping, and held it out. "What's this?" Richard didn't take it. "Eviction notice," Marcus said quietly. 30 days to vacate the premises. I'm exercising my right as the primary beneficiary of the trust that actually owns this house. My father bought it 2 months before he died. You've been living here rent-free for 12 years. Richard grabbed the paper, hands shaking as he read. You can't." "I can." Marcus looked at his mother, saw tears streaming down her face, and felt something crack in his chest. But he didn't stop. "You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. All of you." "Marcus," Elena whispered, "please." "You watched," Marcus said, and his voice broke just slightly. "For 12 years, you watched him lock me out of rooms and refrigerators and cabinets. You watched him call me a beggar. You said nothing." He turned to Patricia. "What else do I need to sign?"
The law office of Thornhill and Associates occupied the entire 43rd floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that made the city's skyline recognizable from postcards. Marcus sat in a conference room with windows overlooking the pre-dawn darkness, still processing the fact that he'd left his stepfather's house 3 hours ago and hadn't looked back. Patricia and James sat across from him, a small mountain of documents between them, while a third lawyer, Evelyn Torres, who specialized in estate management, prepared coffee nobody was drinking. "Before we proceed with the financial particulars," Patricia said, "I want you to understand the scope of what you've inherited. This isn't simply money in an account. It's a legacy your father specifically structured to activate when you were mature enough to handle it responsibly." James slid a leather folder across the table. "The trust contains direct assets of approximately $7.2 billion, as stated. This includes stock portfolios, real estate holdings across 6 countries, a venture capital fund your father established before his death, and the controlling interest in Chen Technologies, the semiconductor firm your great-grandfather founded." Marcus opened the folder with hands that wanted to shake. Numbers swam before his eyes. So many zeros they stopped meaning anything. "My father was a high school physics teacher." "Yes," Patricia said gently, "by choice. After your great-grandfather died, your grandfather expanded Chen Technologies into one of the most successful manufacturers of specialized microchips in the world. When your grandfather passed, your father inherited everything. But David Chen never wanted that life. He placed the assets in trust, hired us to manage them, and went back to teaching. He wanted you to have the freedom to choose your own path, but only after you'd learned what it meant to work, to struggle, to be independent. He wanted me to be locked out of refrigerators?" The bitterness surprised Marcus, made his voice sharper than he intended. "He wanted you to understand hardship," Evelyn said quietly, "so you'd never inflict it on others. Your father's will contains a letter. We're required to give it to you now." James produced an envelope, thick cream paper with Marcus's name written in handwriting he recognized from old birthday cards. His father's script, precise and slightly slanted, the way engineers wrote when they'd learned to draft by hand before computers. Marcus took it but didn't open it, not yet. The weight of it felt like responsibility, like expectation, like love he hadn't been allowed to remember clearly because Richard had made sure every photo album, every memento stayed locked in a storage unit Marcus wasn't permitted to access. "What are my obligations?" Marcus asked. "There must be conditions." Patricia nodded. "The trust requires you to maintain the Chen family legacy in 3 specific ways. First, you must donate at least 3% of the annual trust earnings to educational causes, particularly STEM programs in underserved communities.
Second, you must retain at least 51% ownership of Chen Technologies to ensure it remains family-controlled. Third, you must meet with the Trust's advisory board quarterly to review major financial decisions until you turn 30, at which point you have complete autonomy. That's it? That's it, Patricia smiled. Your father trusted you, Marcus. He trusted that if you grew up experiencing real work, real relationships not built on wealth, you'd use this inheritance wisely. Everything he observed about you before he died suggested you had his character, his kindness, his intellect, his moral compass. Marcus thought about the bookstore where he'd worked for 6 years, first as a high school job Richard had mocked relentlessly, then as his only escape from the house. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, the owner, who'd given him extra shifts when Richard cut off his allowance entirely, who'd let him eat the day-old pastries from the cafe next door when he came in too thin, too hungry, too defeated, who'd never asked questions but always seemed to know. "I want to buy the bookstore," Marcus said suddenly. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been trying to retire for 3 years, but she can't find a buyer who won't turn it into another chain location. Evelyn was already typing on her laptop. What's the asking price? Probably $200,000, maybe less. The building needs work, and the neighborhood isn't—" "Consider it done," Evelyn smiled. "I'll have our real estate team contact her by noon. Anything else immediately pressing?" Marcus thought about the locked refrigerator, about his mother's silence, about Vanessa, who is 13 and learning cruelty as a survival skill because it's what her father taught, about the eviction notice he'd delivered in anger, in hurt, in the kind of vindictive triumph that felt hollow now in the fluorescent light of a law office. "Can I—" he paused, uncertain. "Can I put conditions on the eviction? Like, what if I wanted to let my mother and sister stay, but Richard has to leave?" Patricia exchanged a glance with James. "The house is owned by the trust, which means you control it. You can set any terms you want. But I'd advise caution. Blended family situations can become legally complex, particularly if there's a divorce involved. Your stepfather could claim he's entitled to assets acquired during the marriage."
"He's entitled to nothing," Marcus said, the anger returning sharp and clean. "He contributed nothing except cruelty. But my mother—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "She made choices I can't forgive, but she's still my mother." "Then give yourself time to decide," Evelyn suggested. "The eviction notice allows 30 days. Use that time to determine what kind of person you want to be with this wealth. Because I promise you, Mr. Chen, every decision you make from this moment forward will reveal your character. The money doesn't change who you are, it amplifies it." The sky outside was beginning to lighten, the darkness bleeding into deep blue. Marcus opened his father's letter with careful fingers, unfolding paper that had been sealed for 18 years. "My dearest Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're 25 years old, a man I'll never get to meet but already love more than words can express. I've spent months trying to write this letter, starting over dozens of times. Because how do you condense a lifetime of advice into a few paragraphs? How do you prepare your son for a fortune he won't receive until you're not there to guide him? Here's what I hope for you, that you've known struggle, that you've worked for wages, saved money, learned the value of a dollar, not through lectures but through experience, that you've met people who don't know your family name and liked you anyway, or didn't like you, which is equally valuable, that you've had your heart broken, your pride wounded, your assumptions challenged, because wealth without wisdom is just expensive suffering. The money is yours to use however you see fit. Build something, give it away, travel the world, I don't care. What I care about is that you remember, always, that kindness is the only currency that truly matters. Your great-grandfather built a fortune but died alone because he mistook profit for purpose. Your grandfather learned too late that success without connection is just decorated loneliness. I'm giving you this inheritance early enough that you might avoid our family's mistakes. One more thing. If the person you've become is someone I'd want to sit down and have dinner with, then I succeeded as a father. If not, the money won't fix that. Choose carefully who you are in the world. Choose deliberately. Choose kindly. All my love, always. Dad.
Marcus folded the letter carefully, blinking back tears he hadn't expected. In the quiet of the conference room, surrounded by lawyers who'd guarded this moment for nearly 2 decades, he felt the weight of his father's hope settle onto his shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he'd earned yet. "I need to think about the house situation," he said finally, "but there are some immediate things I want to do. Mrs. Rodriguez's bookstore, obviously, but also," he thought about the past 12 years, about every small cruelty, every locked door, every time Richard had made him feel small. "I want to set up a fund for kids aging out of foster care or growing up in blended families where they're treated like intruders. Education scholarships, housing assistance, therapy resources, whatever they need to build lives that don't depend on people who resent their existence." Patricia was nodding, making notes on a legal pad. "That's an excellent use of the mandatory charitable donation requirement. We can structure it as a foundation, give you full control over grant approvals." "How much can I allocate to it?" "The trust earns approximately $300 million in annual interest and dividends. 3% of that is $9 million yearly. But you could allocate more if you wanted. That's just the minimum required donation." $9 million to help kids like him. $9 million his father had earned, saved, invested, specifically so Marcus could make choices like this. The absurdity of it made him want to laugh and cry simultaneously. 6 hours ago, he'd been photographing a locked refrigerator. Now he was allocating millions to charity. "Let's start with the $9 million, Marcus said. "I want to understand the foundation's impact before I expand it. And I want to be involved, not just signing checks, but actually meeting the kids, understanding their situations. Is that feasible?" "Entirely," Evelyn assured him. "I'll connect you with our nonprofit coordinator. She can help structure site visits, mentorship programs, whatever level of involvement you want." James cleared his throat. "There's one more immediate matter. Chen Technologies' board of directors meets next week. As the controlling shareholder, you're expected to attend. They've been anticipating this transition. We notified them 6 months ago that the trust would activate this year, but they'll want to meet you, understand your vision for the company's future." Marcus had exactly zero vision for a semiconductor company's future. His degree was in English literature, another thing Richard had mocked endlessly, and his work experience topped out at managing a bookstore's inventory system. "What if I don't want to run the company?" "You don't have to," Patricia said. "You just need to maintain controlling interest. The board and CEO handle day-to-day operations. You'd primarily be involved in major strategic decisions, acquisitions, expansions, leadership changes. Think of it as oversight rather than management." "And if I make bad decisions?" "Then the advisory board will tell you," Patricia said with a slight smile. "That's what the quarterly meetings are for. We're not here to control you, Marcus. We're here to keep you from accidentally destroying a legacy your family spent 3 generations building." The absurdity broke through then, and Marcus laughed, the kind of laugh that bordered on hysterical, exhaustion and shock and relief tangling together. 6 hours ago, my biggest problem was a locked refrigerator. Now I'm worried about accidentally destroying a billion-dollar company. "Welcome to wealth," Evelyn said dryly. "It's mostly anxiety dressed up as opportunity." Outside, the city was waking up, traffic beginning to hum, early commuters filing toward train stations, coffee shops flipping their signs to open. Marcus watched it all from his 43rd floor vantage point and felt untethered, like gravity had stopped working and he was floating just slightly above the life he'd known. Everything was different now. Everything was possible. And somehow, that felt more terrifying than the locked refrigerator ever had. Because cruelty was at least familiar territory. Kindness, generosity, power, those were territories he'd have to learn to navigate. And for the first time since midnight, Marcus wondered if he was actually ready for any of this at all. But his father had thought he would be, had trusted that struggle would prepare him, that hardship would teach him wisdom. So Marcus straightened his shoulders, accepted another coffee he wouldn't drink, and asked Patricia to walk him through the details of trust management, stock portfolios, and the intricate machinery of wealth that had been invisibly supporting his life even as Richard tried to grind him down. If nothing else, he owed his father the effort of trying to be worthy of this faith. By the time Marcus left the law office at 7:30 a.m., the city was fully awake, and he was running on nothing but adrenaline and the vague memory of coffee he'd poured but never sipped.
He'd signed so many documents, his signature had devolved from neat cursive to something approaching a scribble. He'd authorized bank transfers, approved stock portfolio reviews, agreed to meeting schedules with advisors whose names he'd already forgotten. And through it all, his phone had been vibrating with increasing urgency. 17 missed calls from his mother's number, 32 text messages from Richard that progressed from confused to angry to threatening to something that looked disturbingly like begging. He silenced his phone and took the train to the bookstore. The morning commute pressed him against strangers in business suits, everyone absorbed in their phones or the middle distance, and Marcus felt the bizarre disconnect of knowing he could buy this entire train car, hell, the entire train, and nobody would ever guess. He was wearing his usual uniform, jeans with worn knees, a sweater that had been cheap 3 years ago, sneakers with that hole in the toe. The only thing marking him as different was the leather folder under his arm containing documents worth billions. The bookstore didn't open until 10, but Marcus had keys. Mrs. Rodriguez had given them to him years ago, trusting him to open on her days off. He let himself in through the back entrance, breathing in the familiar smell of old paper, coffee from the cafe next door, and the particular mustiness of a building that predated air conditioning. The store occupied the ground floor of a narrow brownstone in a neighborhood that had never quite gentrified, wedged between a laundromat and a bodega that sold lottery tickets and the best breakfast sandwiches in 5 blocks. He found Mrs. Rodriguez in her usual spot behind the register, even though they didn't open for another 2 hours. She was reading a mystery novel, glasses perched on her nose, gray hair pulled back in the same bun she'd worn for as long as Marcus had known her. She looked up when he entered, surprise flashing across her weathered face. "Marcus, what are you doing here so early? And dressed so—" She paused, taking in his appearance more carefully. "Like you haven't slept." "I haven't." He set the folder on the counter, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have something to tell you. It's going to sound insane." She closed her book, marking her place carefully with a receipt because she'd taught him that dog-earing pages was sacrilege, and gave him her full attention. "Okay, I'm listening." So he told her. About his father's death 18 years ago, about the trust he'd known existed but couldn't access, about the midnight arrival of lawyers and the revelation of wealth so enormous it didn't feel real. About the locked refrigerator, Richard's cruelty, the eviction notice he'd delivered in the dark. About his father's letter and the mandate to be kind, to choose deliberately, to use money as a tool for purpose rather than power. And then he told her about the offer Evelyn was preparing, the purchase of the bookstore at asking price, with a stipulation that Mrs. Rodriguez stay on as manager for as long as she wanted, at whatever salary made her comfortable, with full health insurance and a retirement plan and every benefit he could think to include. By the time he finished, Mrs. Rodriguez was crying silently, tears tracking down her cheeks while her hands stayed perfectly still on the counter. "Marcus," she whispered, "you don't have to do this." "I know, but I want to. You've kept me employed for 6 years. You fed me when I was hungry. You've never asked questions when I came in with bruises or looking defeated. You've just been kind, consistently, quietly kind. And I want to make sure you never have to worry about this place closing or losing it to some developer who'll turn it into luxury condos." She came around the counter and hugged him, a fierce, tight embrace that smelled like lavender and old books. "Your father would be so proud of you." "You didn't know him." "I knew you," she said, "and that tells me everything about him." They sat in the small office in the back, surrounded by towers of books waiting to be shelved, and worked out the details. Mrs. Rodriguez would stay on as manager, training Marcus in the actual business of running a bookstore beyond just working the register. They'd renovate the upstairs apartment, currently a storage nightmare of boxes and old furniture, into a proper living space where Marcus could stay until he figured out where home was supposed to be now. They'd expand the children's section, add more community programming, maybe partner with local schools for literacy events. "What about your family?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked finally. "Your mother and stepfather, what happens to them?" Marcus pulled out his phone, looked at the notifications he'd been ignoring. "I don't know yet. I have 30 days to decide." "And your sister, Vanessa, right? You've mentioned her." "She's 13.
She's learned to be cruel because that's what Richard taught her. But she's still a kid. She didn't choose this mess any more than I did. Marcus rubbed his eyes, exhaustion catching up with him in waves. I don't want to punish her for Richard's mistakes, but I also don't know how to fix a family that's been broken for 12 years. Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, measuring her words. When my daughter was 16, she told me she hated me, said I'd ruined her life by divorcing her father. And maybe I had. Certainly I'd disrupted it, but I had to believe that choosing my own safety, my own sanity, was teaching her something important about boundaries, about not accepting cruelty as love. She met Marcus's eyes. You don't owe your stepfather forgiveness, but you might owe yourself the chance to find out who your mother and sister could be without him. It was good advice, the kind that sat uncomfortably because it required more emotional work than simple vengeance. Marcus nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Right now, I mostly want to sleep for approximately 16 hours. The apartment's yours, Mrs. Rodriguez said. I'll have the cleaning service come this week. Get it habitable. You focus on all those lawyer meetings and billion-dollar decisions. She said it lightly, but Marcus heard the adjustment in her voice, the slight distance that money was already creating between them. He'd have to watch for that, he realized. Have to work to preserve relationships that money could poison if he wasn't careful. This was another kind of burden his father's letter had warned about. Success without connection was just decorated loneliness. By noon, he'd helped Mrs. Rodriguez with the morning rush, a trickle of regulars who knew him by name, who asked about his weekend and recommended books, and treated him exactly the way they always had, because they didn't know anything had changed. It was the most normal Marcus had felt in 12 hours, this rhythm of scanning books and making change and chatting about whether the new thriller release was worth the hype. Then his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Hello? Mr. Chen, this is Detective Sarah Moss with the City Police Department. I'm calling about a report we received this morning from a Richard Castellanos. He's claiming you stole property from his residence and are attempting to illegally evict him from his home.
Marcus felt his stomach drop. He called the police? Yes, he's quite insistent that you've committed fraud and theft. I'm required to investigate the claim. Would you be willing to come to the station and provide your statement? I have lawyers. Should I call them first? Detective Moss's tone shifted slightly, becoming less formal. That's probably wise, given the amounts of money Mr. Castellanos is claiming, but I'll tell you off the record, the ownership documents he provided for the house don't match public records. The property's been in trust ownership since 2007, so either you're committing an extremely elaborate fraud, or Mr. Castellanos is about to have a very uncomfortable conversation about filing false police reports. Relief and anger warred in Marcus's chest. He's lied to me for 12 years about everything. Why would this be different? Come by the station with your lawyers and documentation. We'll sort it out. But, Mr. Chen, be prepared for this to get uglier before it gets better. Money has a way of revealing who people really are. After Marcus hung up, he called Patricia, who assured him in her unflappable way that she'd have James meet him at the police station with every relevant document. She also noted that filing a false police report could result in charges against Richard, and did Marcus want to pursue that? He thought about his father's letter, about choosing kindness deliberately, about the difference between justice and vengeance. Not yet, Marcus said. Let's just set the record straight. But if he keeps trying to make my life difficult, then yes, I'll press charges. The police station was everything cop shows had promised. Fluorescent lights, uncomfortable chairs, the smell of burnt coffee, and bureaucratic resignation. Marcus sat in an interview room with James, who'd brought a briefcase containing what looked like the entire trust documentation library. Detective Moss reviewed everything methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions, while Richard sat in a separate room, presumably spinning his own version of events. After an hour, Detective Moss closed her file folder with an expression of professional neutrality that Marcus suspected hid frustration. The property ownership is clear. The house belongs to the trust, which Mr. Chen now controls. The eviction notice is legally valid. Mr. Castellanos' report is unfounded. What happens to him? Marcus asked. That depends on you.
You could press charges for filing a false report, defamation, potentially fraud if you want to go into his claims about property ownership during your minority, or you could let it go. Marcus looked at James, who'd remained perfectly silent throughout. Your recommendation? Document everything, James said. Don't press charges now, but make it clear you will if he continues to harass you, and consider a restraining order if the contact escalates. Money makes people desperate, Mr. Chen. Desperate people make poor decisions. So they filed a formal response refuting Richard's claims, had Detective Moss add everything to the official record, and left with the understanding that Richard now knew the police wouldn't help him, which meant, Marcus suspected, the real trouble was about to start. He was right. By the time he got back to the bookstore, his phone had exploded with messages, not just from Richard and his mother, but from relatives Marcus barely remembered. Aunts and uncles he hadn't seen since his father's funeral, cousins who'd never called on his birthday, second and third connections who'd apparently heard through some family grapevine that Marcus Chen has inherited billions, and perhaps he'd like to invest in their restaurant, startup, real estate venture, cryptocurrency scheme. Mrs. Rodriguez took one look at his face and poured him tea. Family crawling out of the woodwork? Like roaches when you turn on the lights. You'll need to learn to say no, firmly, repeatedly, without guilt. I don't know how to do that. Practice, she said simply. Start with the small asks, the people who want lunch money or help with rent. Those are easy no's because you don't owe them anything. Save your generosity for situations where you're helping, not enabling. Marcus thought about the foundation he'd discussed with Patricia, about helping kids who actually need support versus relatives who saw him as a lottery ticket. How do you tell the difference? If someone wants money because they're entitled to it just for being related to you, that's enabling. If someone needs help and has a plan for how they'll use it, that's worth considering. But you're 25, Marcus. You're not obligated to solve everyone's problems just because you suddenly can. It was permission he needed to hear, and wisdom he'd spend years learning to apply. For now, he turned off his phone entirely, helped Mrs. Rodriguez close up the bookstore, and tried to remember what normal evening routines used to feel like before his life had split neatly into before midnight and after midnight categories. Somewhere across the city, Richard was probably plotting his next move. His mother was probably crying, caught between her husband and her son. Vanessa was probably confused, angry, maybe even scared about losing the only home she'd known. And Marcus was sitting in a bookstore, surrounded by stories about other people's complicated lives, trying to figure out how to write his own next chapter without becoming the villain in someone else's story. His father's letter was still in his pocket, refolded carefully. He pulled it out, reread the line about choosing kindness deliberately, and wondered what that looked like when the people around you had chosen cruelty first, when protecting yourself felt like abandoning others, when the money that should have solved problems only seemed to multiply them. Outside, streetlights flickered on against the gathering dusk. Marcus locked the bookstore's front door, double-checking it the way Mrs. Rodriguez had taught him years ago, and headed toward the train that would take him back to the lawyer's office to sign more papers, make more decisions, take more steps into a future he hadn't quite figured out how to inhabit yet. But at least, he'd never have to photograph a locked refrigerator again. That much was progress, even if nothing else felt certain.
3 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, financial reviews, and the peculiar disorientation of having more money than sense about what to do with it. Marcus moved into the apartment above the bookstore. Mrs. Rodriguez had the cleaning service work miracles, transforming a storage disaster into something livable, if not luxurious. He'd bought actual furniture, stood in an IKEA feeling absurd because he could technically buy the entire store but had no idea which desk would fit in his new bedroom. He'd hired an assistant named Priya who specialized in managing newly wealthy individuals, helping them navigate charity requests, investment opportunities, and the endless parade of people who wanted meetings to discuss synergy. The Chen Technologies board meeting had gone better than expected. The CEO, a sharp woman named Dr. Lin, who'd worked with his grandfather, had sized Marcus up in about 30 seconds and said, "You're here to learn, not lead. Good, we'll teach you."
She'd introduced him to the department heads, walked him through the company's current projects, something about 5G infrastructure and automotive applications that went mostly over his head, and made it clear that his primary job was to not accidentally tank the company his family had spent decades building. Marcus liked her immediately. The foundation was harder. He'd met with the nonprofit coordinator, a patient man named Thomas, who'd helped him understand that changing lives required more than signing checks. They'd toured after-school programs, talked to social workers, visited a transitional housing facility where teenagers aging out of foster care tried to build independent lives with almost no support system. Marcus had seen himself in their faces, the wariness, the carefully maintained pride, the exhaustion of having to be hyper-competent just to survive. He'd cried in the car afterward, surprising himself and probably concerning Thomas. "It gets easier," Thomas had said quietly. "Not the feeling. You should never stop feeling it. But the overwhelm, the sense that you can't possibly help everyone. You'll learn to focus on sustainable change rather than emergency fixes." Now, 23 days after his birthday, Marcus stood in his small apartment above the bookstore and stared at his phone. Tomorrow was the 30th day, the eviction deadline. He'd have to make a decision about his mother and Vanessa, about Richard, about what justice looked like when it couldn't undo 12 years of accumulated hurt. His mother had called twice. He'd answered once, 3 days ago, and the conversation had lasted maybe 90 seconds before he'd hung up, hands shaking. She'd wanted to explain, to contextualize, to help him understand why she'd stayed silent while Richard systematically broke him down. But explanations weren't the same as apologies, and Marcus hadn't been ready to hear excuses disguised as reasons. Vanessa hadn't called at all. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, her silence or the possibility that Richard had forbidden her from reaching out. There was a knock on his apartment door, the external entrance, not the one leading down to the bookstore. Marcus opened it to find Detective Moss standing in the hallway, looking tired and holding a manila folder. "Mr. Chen, got a minute?" "Is Richard in trouble?" Marcus asked, stepping aside to let her in. "Not exactly." She sat at his small kitchen table without waiting for invitation, cop casual that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "But I wanted to give you a heads up before it hits the news. Your stepfather filed for bankruptcy this morning. Claims he's destitute, can't afford housing, demands the eviction be reversed on humanitarian grounds." Marcus blinked. He runs a real estate company. Ran, past tense. Turns out most of his business assets were leveraged against the house he thought he owned. When you took that away, the whole structure collapsed. He's got maybe $15,000 in accessible cash and about $400,000 in debt. How is that my problem? Detective Moss held up her hands. It's not. Legally, morally, ethically, not your problem. But there's a complication. Your mother and sister are listed as dependents in his bankruptcy filing. If they don't have alternate housing arrangements by tomorrow, they'll end up in a temporary shelter situation. Family Services is involved now because Vanessa's a minor. The weight of it hit Marcus in the chest. He's using them as leverage. Smart move on his part, legally speaking. You kick him out, you're also displacing a child. That looks bad in family court, even though you're not technically responsible for her. "But I am," Marcus said quietly. "She's my sister, half-sister, whatever. She's 13 and about to lose her home because I wanted revenge on her father." "You wanted justice," Detective Moss corrected. "There's a difference. But yeah, the collateral damage is real." She slid the folder across the table. "For what it's worth, I've seen your stepfather's type before. Bullies who mistake control for strength. They usually fold when someone finally stands up to them, but they burn everything on the way down." After Detective Moss left, Marcus sat at his kitchen table for a long time, watching the city lights outside his window and thinking about choices that didn't have clean answers. He could let the eviction proceed, send Richard into bankruptcy and his mother and sister into chaos, and technically be justified because none of this was his fault. Or he could do something harder, something that required extending grace he didn't feel and forgiveness he hadn't granted. His father's letter was on the kitchen counter, living there now because Marcus read it every morning. Kindness is the only currency that truly matters. But how much kindness did you owe people who'd taken yours for granted? Where was the line between compassion and enabling? He called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. Unsurprised, he'd learned that lawyers who manage billions didn't really have office hours in the traditional sense. The eviction deadline is tomorrow, Marcus said. I need to make a decision and I need it to be legally airtight. I'm listening. I'll let my mother and Vanessa stay in the house, but Richard has to leave, restraining order, legally binding, whatever it takes. And my mother has to agree to therapy, both for herself and with me. Family counseling, weekly sessions, non-negotiable. If she stops going, the arrangement ends. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's generous, probably more than she deserves. I know, but Vanessa deserves a chance to grow up somewhere that isn't a shelter or chaos. And my mother. Marcus paused, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. She made terrible choices, but she's still my mom. I need to at least try to figure out if there's something worth salvaging there. And Richard gets nothing. No access to the house, no financial support, no second chances. He evicted himself when he decided cruelty was an acceptable parenting strategy. I'll have James draft everything tonight. You'll need to present it to them by noon tomorrow to meet the deadline. Are you prepared for Richard's reaction? Marcus thought about the locked refrigerator, about being called a beggar at dinner, about 12 years of systematic degradation disguised as tough love. Yeah, I'm prepared. The next morning, Marcus met his family at the house that technically belonged to him but still felt like enemy territory. Richard answered the door with a lawyer of his own, some strip-mall attorney who'd probably taken the case on contingency, hoping for a settlement. Marcus's mother stood behind them, looking smaller than he remembered, while Vanessa lurked at the top of the stairs in her school uniform, watching the drama unfold. James presented the revised terms with clinical precision. Elena and Vanessa could remain in the house rent-free for 2 years, with an option to renew if therapy requirements were met. Richard had 24 hours to remove his belongings and leave the property. A restraining order prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of Elena, Vanessa, or Marcus. Any violation resulted in immediate arrest and full eviction of all parties. Richard Stace went through a complicated journey. Shock, to rage, to calculation, to something that might have been fear. You can't do this. He can, James said mildly. The house belongs to the trust. Mr. Chen is the sole beneficiary. These terms are legally enforceable. You're going to make your mother homeless? Your sister? You made me homeless, Marcus said quietly. Every time you locked me out of a room, out of cabinets, out of the refrigerator, you made sure I knew I didn't belong here. Now I'm making sure you know the same thing. Richard turned to Elena, desperate now. Are you going to let him do this? Choose your son over your husband? Elena looked at Richard for a long moment, then at Marcus. Her face was pale, eyes red from what looked like days of crying. I should have chosen him years ago, she said. I should have chosen him the first time you locked his bedroom door and called it discipline. The first time you mocked his job, his major, his existence. I didn't. I was a coward. But I'm choosing now. The silence that followed was profound. Vanessa came down the stairs slowly, stopping beside her mother. Does this mean we get to stay? Marcus looked at his half-sister properly for the first time in what felt like years. She was 13, awkward in that teenage way, and her expression was guarded but hopeful. Yeah, you get to stay, but things are going to be different. Different how? Different like... Marcus paused, trying to find words for something he barely understood. Different like, we're going to try being an actual family instead of people who happen to live in the same house. Mom's going to therapy. You should probably go too. And he stopped, surprised by the emotion catching in his throat. I'm going to try to be a better brother than I've been, if you'll let me.
Vanessa looked at her father, then back at Marcus. Something shifted in her face, like a mask coming off. Can I still go to my school? Yeah, everything stays the same for you, except your dad won't be here anymore. Good, Vanessa said, so quietly Marcus almost missed it. He scares me sometimes. The admission hung in the air, validating and terrible. Richard's lawyer was conferring with him in urgent whispers, probably explaining that he had no legal standing and fighting this would only make things worse.
Marcus watched his stepfather's face as the reality settled in. This wasn't a negotiation he could win through intimidation or manipulation. The power had shifted completely, irreversibly. "You'll regret this," Richard said finally, trying for menace but landing somewhere near pathetic. "Probably," Marcus agreed, "but I'll regret it less than I'd regret abandoning my sister to a shelter because I was too angry to make hard choices." The admission hung in the air, validating and terrible. Richard's lawyer was conferring with him in urgent whispers, probably explaining that he had no legal standing and fighting this would only make things worse. Marcus watched his stepfather's face as the reality settled in. This wasn't a negotiation he could win through intimidation or manipulation. The power had shifted completely, irreversibly. "You'll regret this," Richard said finally, trying for menace but landing somewhere near pathetic. "Probably," Marcus agreed, "but I'll regret it less than I'd regret abandoning my sister to a shelter because I was too angry to make hard choices." James handed Richard's lawyer the formal documents, and just like that, it was done. Richard had 24 hours to pack and leave. Elena and Vanessa had 2 years to figure out their next steps, and Marcus had whatever came after this, the messy work of rebuilding relationships that had been fractured long before midnight on his birthday. After the lawyers left and Richard disappeared upstairs to pack with dramatic door slamming, Marcus sat in the living room with his mother and sister. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, like removing Richard had let air back into rooms that had been suffocating for years. "I'm sorry," Elena said. "I know that's not enough, but I am. I'm so sorry for everything." Marcus didn't answer immediately. Sorry was just a word, and words were cheap when actions had been expensive. But he thought about his father's letter, about choosing deliberately, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. "I don't forgive you yet," he said carefully. "Maybe I will eventually, but right now, I need you to understand that you watched someone hurt me for 12 years and did nothing. That's not something I can just get over." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. The therapy, I'll go. I'll do whatever it takes." "It's not for me," Marcus said. "I mean, partially it is, but mostly it's for you. You need to figure out why you stayed with someone who treated your son like that, why you let fear or comfort or whatever it was matter more than protecting me." Vanessa had been quiet through this exchange, picking at the hem of her school uniform. Now she looked up, her expression uncertain. "Are you rich? Like, really rich? Everyone at school is saying you inherited billions." Marcus couldn't help but laugh, the question so absurdly teenage in the middle of this emotional wreckage. "Yeah, I'm really rich." "Are you going to be one of those weird rich people who forgets where they came from?" "I hope not. That's why I'm living above a bookstore instead of buying some mansion." "Can I visit? The bookstore, I mean, not like to ask for money or anything. Just, it sounds better than here." "Yeah," Marcus said, feeling something loosen in his chest. "Yeah, you can visit, whenever you want." They sat together in the living room as afternoon light slanted through windows that had witnessed so many terrible dinners, so many locked doors, so many small cruelties that accumulated into a childhood Marcus was still processing. But maybe, this was what redemption looked like. Not erasing the past, but refusing to let it define every future moment. Choosing, deliberately and imperfectly, to build something new from the rubble. Upstairs, Richard was slamming drawers and muttering to himself. Tomorrow, he'd be gone, and the house would belong to the people he'd tried so hard to make feel like intruders. It wasn't perfect justice. It didn't undo 12 years of damage, but it was something. A beginning, a foundation, a small architectural sketch of what family might look like if they were brave enough to build it. Marcus pulled out his phone and texted Mrs. Rodriguez. "Family stuff is complicated, but maybe getting better. I'll be back to work tomorrow." She responded immediately. "Good, we got a shipment of new releases and I need your terrible opinions on cover designs." He smiled, pocketing his phone. This was what normal looked like now. Billion-dollar trusts and family reconciliation and arguing about book covers with a woman who's shown him more consistent kindness than most of his blood relatives. It was messy and uncertain, and nothing like the revenge fantasy he'd imagined during all those hungry nights staring at locked refrigerators. But his father had been right. Kindness was harder than vengeance, and more valuable because of it. Marcus just had to figure out how to keep choosing it, deliberately and daily, even when every instinct screamed for easier paths. He stood up, brushed off his jeans, and headed for the door. "I'll be back next week," he told his mother and Vanessa, "for the first therapy session. Don't skip it." "We won't," Elena promised. Marcus believed her, or at least he believed she believed herself in this moment. The real test would come later, when the crisis faded and old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But that was future Marcus's problem. Present Marcus had done what he could, drawing boundaries and extending grace in equal measure, and now he needed to get back to his apartment and sleep for approximately 12 hours. As he walked to the train station, his phone buzzed with an email from Thomas at the foundation. They'd found their first scholarship recipient, a 17-year-old girl aging out of foster care who wanted to study engineering but had no family support and no clear path to college. The foundation would cover tuition, housing, and living expenses for 4 years, plus mentorship connections through Chen Technologies. Marcus read the girl's essay about designing medical devices for underserved communities and felt something shift in his chest. Purpose, maybe, or the beginning of understanding what his father had meant about using wealth wisely. This was what the money was for. Not revenge, not even justice exactly, but transformation. Taking pain and converting it into possibility for people who needed it most. He boarded the train feeling lighter than he had in weeks, surrounded by commuters who still had no idea who he was or what his bank account looked like. Just another 25-year-old heading home from a difficult family conversation, trying to figure out how to be a decent person in a complicated world. The bookstore lights were still on when he got back. Mrs. Rodriguez working late, probably reorganizing the mystery section for the 3rd time this month because she couldn't help herself. Marcus climbed the external stairs to his apartment, unlocked the door, and stood in the small space that was truly his for the first time in his life. No locked doors, no humiliation at dinner, no stepfather monitoring his movements or mocking his choices. Just a quiet apartment above a bookstore, a trust fund with enough money to help thousands of people, and the difficult, ongoing work of figuring out who he wanted to be now that survival wasn't his primary occupation. His father's letter was still on the kitchen counter. Marcus picked it up, reread it one more time, and carefully placed it in a frame he'd bought last week. He hung it on the wall beside his desk, where he'd see it every morning, a reminder of expectations he still wasn't sure he could meet, and faith that maybe he didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of it. Outside, the city hummed with its evening rhythms. Somewhere, Richard was packing boxes and planning his next move. Somewhere, Elena and Vanessa were figuring out how to live in a house without fear. And somewhere, a 17-year-old girl who didn't know it yet was about to get an email that would change her life. Marcus made himself dinner, actual food from his own refrigerator that nobody could lock, and settled in to answer the 47 emails Priya had flagged as requiring his attention. Foundation grant requests, investment opportunities, family members he'd never met asking for loans. Each one a small test of his judgment, his boundaries, his ability to distinguish between helping and enabling. It was exhausting. It was overwhelming. It was exactly what his father had prepared him for, even if the preparation had looked like hardship at the time. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus was starting to understand that the real inheritance wasn't the money at all. It was the capacity to survive difficulty and choose kindness anyway. To know what cruelty felt like and refuse to inflict it. To have power and wield it carefully, deliberately, with the understanding that every choice reveals character and every character shapes the world in small, accumulating ways. He had 30 more years of this ahead of him, minimum. 30 years of decisions and complications and the messy work of being human with resources most people would never have. But tonight, in his small apartment above a bookstore, eating pasta he'd cooked himself in a kitchen that belonged to him, Marcus thought maybe he could do it. Maybe he could be the person his father had hoped for, the person Mrs. Rodriguez believed in, the person that 17-year-old scholarship recipient would one day thank, the person his sister might eventually trust, and his mother might eventually deserve forgiveness from, and he himself could look at in the mirror without flinching. It wouldn't happen overnight, but then again, the best things never did. They happened gradually, deliberately, through accumulated choices that built towards something larger than any single moment. Upstairs, Richard was slamming drawers and muttering to himself. Tomorrow, he'd be gone, and the house would belong to the people he'd tried so hard to make feel like intruders. It wasn't perfect justice. It didn't undo 12 years of damage, but it was.
6 months later, Marcus stood in the conference room of Chen Technologies watching Dr. Lin present the quarterly earnings report, and for the first time since inheriting billions, he actually understood what the numbers meant. Not completely. He'd probably never have her fluency with semiconductor supply chains and automotive integration forecasts, but enough to ask intelligent questions and make informed decisions. Enough to feel like a steward of his family's legacy rather than just a placeholder with a famous last name. The company was expanding into sustainable technology, partnering with solar panel manufacturers to develop more efficient microchips. It was Marcus's first major strategic suggestion, born from conversations with Thomas about climate change's disproportionate impact on the communities their foundation served. Dr. Lin had been skeptical initially, but the board had approved a pilot program, and early results were promising enough that they were moving toward full implementation. Questions? Dr. Lin asked, closing her presentation. Marcus glanced at his notes. He'd learned to take them during meetings, a habit Mrs. Rodriguez had taught him when training him on bookstore inventory management. The production timeline assumes no supply chain disruptions, but given the current geopolitical situation, shouldn't we have contingency plans for material shortages? Dr. Lin smiled, the expression of a teacher pleased with a student's progress. Already built into the secondary projections. I didn't include them in the main presentation because they're pessimistic scenarios, but yes, we have backup suppliers identified and contracts drafted. You're learning to think like your grandfather. The compliment sat warmly in Marcus's chest as the meeting dispersed. He'd never known his grandfather beyond stories and photographs, but apparently the man had been brilliant at anticipating problems before they materialized. Marcus liked the idea of inheriting that trait along with the money, of genetic predisposition toward careful planning revealing itself now that he had resources to plan with. His phone buzzed with a reminder, therapy session in 45 minutes. He'd been going weekly since that confrontation with his mother 6 months ago, working through 12 years of accumulated trauma with a therapist named Dr. Patel who specialized in family dynamics and complex grief. The sessions were exhausting, frequently painful, and absolutely necessary. Marcus had learned that you couldn't just inherit billions and expect your psyche to adjust smoothly. Wealth didn't heal wounds, it just made them more expensive to ignore. Elena and Vanessa joined him for family sessions twice a month. The progress was slow, marked by setbacks and difficult conversations, and the occasional session where everyone cried and nobody felt better afterward. But there was progress. Elena had started individual therapy too, working through whatever combination of fear and codependency had kept her silent during Richard's systematic cruelty. She'd gotten a job, administrative work at a nonprofit, and talked about eventually moving out of the house, building a life that didn't depend on Marcus's generosity or Richard's control. Vanessa was harder to read. At 13, she was old enough to remember the before times, but young enough to be shaped by the after. She visited the bookstore regularly now, helping Mrs. Rodriguez with inventory and occasionally asking Marcus questions about money, family, and how you knew when to forgive people who'd hurt you. He never had good answers, just honest ones about his own ongoing confusion. Richard had disappeared into the kind of quiet desperation that happened when bullies lost their power. He'd found work at a different real estate firm, taken a pay cut, moved into a one-bedroom apartment across the city. He'd tried to contact Vanessa a few times, phone calls, emails, showing up at her school, until Marcus's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter reminding him about the restraining order. Marcus didn't know if Richard had changed, learned, or grown. Mostly, he tried not to think about his stepfather at all. The foundation had grown substantially. They'd awarded 47 scholarships to young people aging out of foster care or navigating difficult family situations. They'd partnered with 3 after-school programs to provide mentorship, tutoring, and college preparation resources.
They'd funded a transitional housing facility that helped teenagers develop independent living skills without the trauma of homelessness. Thomas sent Marcus updates weekly, and occasionally they'd visit recipients together, young people who reminded Marcus viscerally of his own younger self, navigating systems designed to defeat them. The bookstore had undergone renovations too. They'd expanded the children's section, added comfortable reading nooks with donated furniture, started hosting weekly story times that drew families from across the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez had hired 2 additional staff members, lightening her workload enough that she'd started taking weekends off for the first time in a decade. She was dating someone, a retired teacher she'd met at a library fundraiser, and had the particular glow that came from discovering joy after assuming those opportunities had passed. Marcus's apartment above the store had evolved from temporary crash pad to actual home. He'd bought art, original pieces from local artists, and filled the bookshelves with a combination of classics and contemporary fiction. He'd learned to cook beyond pasta and eggs, taking classes at a community center where nobody knew he was a billionaire, and everyone just wanted to learn proper knife skills. He'd made friends, actual friends, not networking connections or people who wanted investment capital, people who liked him because he was thoughtful about book recommendations, and funny when he wasn't trying to be, and genuinely interested in their lives. One of those friends was Maya, who worked at the cafe next door and had opinions about coffee that bordered on militant. She'd asked him out 3 months ago, casual and direct, and Marcus had said yes before his anxiety could generate reasons why dating was complicated for someone with his net worth. They'd gone to museums and cheap restaurants and bookstore readings, and she'd never once asked about his bank account or suggested he should be living differently. When he'd finally told her about the trust fund, 4th date, over Thai food that was too spicy for either of them, she'd blinked once and said, "Okay, does this mean you're paying for dinner?" He'd laughed, relieved beyond measure. "I can do that." "Good, but I'm paying next time. I have my own money, Chen. I'm not a charity case." That had mattered more than she probably realized, being seen as Marcus, not as $7 billion wearing a human suit. They weren't serious yet, weren't making long-term plans, but they were building something real in the small, deliberate way that trust accumulated. She knew about Richard, about the locked refrigerator, about his ongoing therapy and complicated family dynamics. She knew and stayed anyway, which felt like its own kind of inheritance. Now Marcus took the train to Dr. Patel's office, the commute so familiar he barely registered the stops anymore. The waiting room held the usual collection of people visibly uncomfortable with vulnerability, everyone staring at phones or magazines, avoiding eye contact. Marcus checked his own phone and found an email from the scholarship committee. They'd received an application from a 19-year-old named Jordan who'd been homeless for 6 months after aging out of foster care, living in their car while working 2 jobs and maintaining a 4.0 GPA at community college. The essay attached was about studying urban planning to design cities that didn't abandon their most vulnerable residents. Marcus forwarded it to Thomas with a note, "This one, full funding, whatever they need." Dr. Patel called him back to her office, a small room decorated with plants and abstract art that somehow managed to feel both professional and comfortable. She was in her 60s, with gray hair cut short and an expression of perpetual thoughtful attention. "How are you?" she asked, the way she always did, not perfunctorily, but genuinely interested in the answer. Marcus settled into his usual chair. "I'm okay. Good, actually. The company meeting went well. I'm starting to feel like I actually belong in those rooms." "That's progress. What else?" "Maya and I are going to her parents' house for dinner next week, meeting the family. I'm terrified." Dr. Patel smiled slightly. "Why?" "Because," Marcus paused, examining his own anxiety, "because I don't know how to be normal anymore. Do I tell them about the money? Do I pretend I'm just some guy who works at a bookstore? What if they look me up online and think I'm hiding things? What does Maya think?" "She says to just be myself and let them draw their own conclusions. But herself is easy for her to be. I'm still figuring out who myself is supposed to be now." They spent the session working through that question. Identity reconstruction after trauma, the difference between authentic self and performance, how to integrate enormous wealth into a personality that had developed under conditions of scarcity. Dr. Patel didn't offer answers so much as help Marcus find his own, pushing back gently when he started catastrophizing and affirming when he articulated genuine insights. "You've made remarkable progress in 6 months," she said near the end. "You've established boundaries with your family, built relationships not contingent on money, started using your resources to help others. Your father would be proud."
"How do you know?" Marcus asked. "You never met him?" "I read his letter. You showed it to me in our second session, remember? And anyone who writes that kind of letter, who thinks that carefully about preparing their child for wealth, that person cared about character more than comfort. You're honoring that legacy." After therapy, Marcus walked to the bookstore instead of taking the train. The city was warm with early summer, trees fully leafed, people out in that particular urban way where everyone was both together and alone. He thought about the past 6 months, about everything that had changed and everything still changing, about Richard's absence and Vanessa's tentative trust and his mother's slow, painful growth, about the scholarship recipients whose lives were shifting trajectories because his father had been wise enough to save, invest, and structure a trust that activated at exactly the right moment, about the locked refrigerator, which had become almost totemic in his memory, the moment when humiliation crystallized into something harder, more determined. He didn't think about it as often now, but when he did, he tried to feel grateful for it. Not grateful for the cruelty, but for what it had taught him about the weight of small, accumulated kindnesses, about how easily power could corrupt and how deliberately you had to choose otherwise. Mrs. Rodriguez was helping a customer when he arrived, recommending mysteries with the kind of passionate authority that made people trust her taste. Marcus slipped behind the counter, logged into the inventory system, and started processing new arrivals. This was still his favorite part of running the store, unpacking books, scanning them into the database, deciding where they belonged on the shelves. There was something meditative about it, sorting stories into categories and genres, building an ecosystem where readers could find exactly what they needed. Maya appeared in the doorway around 4, carrying 2 coffees and a bag of pastries. "Thought you might want a break." They sat in the reading nook Marcus had built, comfortable chairs, good lighting, view of the street, and talked about nothing consequential. Her day at the cafe, his board meeting, whether they should try the new Italian restaurant that had opened 3 blocks over. Normal conversation, normal relationship, normal life that happened to include billions in the background but didn't revolve around it. "You nervous about meeting my parents?" Maya asked eventually. "Terrified," Marcus admitted. "What if they hate me?" "They'll love you. You're thoughtful, employed, and you haven't murdered anyone. The bar is shockingly low. What if they think I'm not good enough for you?" Maya laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Marcus, you run a bookstore and a charitable foundation. You're learning corporate management from one of the most brilliant CEOs in tech. You're working through family trauma with remarkable maturity. You're good enough for anyone. I locked my stepfather out of a house. Your stepfather locked you out of a refrigerator. I'd say you showed restraint." It was the casual way she said it, not dismissing his guilt, but reframing his actions as proportional responses rather than character flaws, that made Marcus realize how much his perspective had shifted. 6 months ago, he'd delivered that eviction notice in anger and vindication. Now he could see it as a necessary boundary, imperfectly executed, but ultimately just. He still didn't know if he'd made all the right choices, but he was learning to live with ambiguity, with the understanding that complex situations rarely had clean resolutions. They finished their coffee as customers filtered in and out, the after-work crowd, people buying books for trains and bedtime, browsers who stayed for hours and occasionally bought nothing. Marcus loved this rhythm, the democracy of it. Rich and poor, young and old, everyone equal in their need for stories. Nobody caring that the guy restocking the science fiction section happened to be a billionaire, because what mattered was whether he could recommend something good. At 6, Mrs. Rodriguez shooed them both out. "Go have dinner. Be young and irresponsible. I'll close up." They walked to a taco place neither of them had tried, ordered too much food, and talked about the future in the speculative way people did when building something together. Maybe they'd travel next year. Maya had always wanted to see Japan. Maybe Marcus would take a more active role in the foundation's programming. Maybe they'd get a dog, though the apartment was probably too small. Maybe. A whole life of possibilities stretching ahead,
no longer constrained by locked doors or cruel stepfathers or the kind of scarcity that made every choice feel permanent. Later, walking Maya back to her apartment, Marcus's phone rang with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, his default now, since inheriting wealth had made him public in ways he's still adjusting to, but something made him answer. Marcus Chen? Yes. This is Jordan Reeves. I got an email today about the scholarship from your foundation. Marcus's heart jumped. Jordan, yes, how are you? The voice on the other end broke slightly. I'm in my car right now. I've been living in it for 6 months. And this scholarship, it's full tuition, housing, stipend, everything. I don't understand. Why me? Because you're working 2 jobs and maintaining a 4.0, and you have a vision for making cities better, Marcus said. Because you deserve a chance to build the life you're capable of living. Because, he paused, aware of Maya listening, aware of the weight of this moment. Because someone did the same thing for me once, and now it's my turn to do it for you. Jordan was crying, trying to hide it and failing. Thank you. I can't. Thank you. You don't have to thank me. Just build something good. Help people when you can. That's all the payment I need. After he hung up, Maya was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That's what you do with the money? Change people's lives like that? Try to, Marcus said. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I screw it up, but I'm trying. She kissed him then, right there on the sidewalk with pedestrians flowing around them, and when she pulled back, she said, "You're going to be fine meeting my parents. They'll love you." Marcus walked back to his apartment feeling lighter than he had in months, maybe years. The evening was warm, the city humming with its million simultaneous stories, and somewhere across town, Jordan Reeves was probably still sitting in their car, processing the reality that homelessness had an expiration date now, that college was possible, that the future had just expanded from survival to actual dreams. This was what the money was for, not revenge or vindication or even justice exactly, but transformation, taking pain and converting it into possibility. Building systems that helped people the way Marcus wished someone had helped him during those years of locked refrigerators and systematic diminishment. His father's letter was waiting when he got home, framed on the wall beside his desk. Marcus read it again. He'd memorized it by now, but the physical act of reading still mattered, and felt the weight of that final instruction. Choose carefully who you are in the world. He was choosing, daily, imperfectly, with frequent mistakes and occasional triumphs. Choosing therapy over avoidance, choosing boundaries over revenge, choosing to fund scholarships and renovate bookstores and show up for family sessions even when they hurt, choosing Maya, Mrs. Rodriguez, and the small accumulated kindnesses that build lives worth living. It wasn't the inheritance his stepfather had assumed awaited him, some transformation into a different person, untethered from struggle. Marcus was still himself, still carrying 12 years of trauma, still figuring out how to inhabit a life this different from everything he'd known. But he was learning to say no to relatives who wanted loans they'd never repay, learning to say yes to relationships built on mutual respect, learning that wealth was just a tool, and tools only matter in the context of what you built with them. He opened his laptop and started drafting an email to Dr. Lin about expanding the Sustainable Technology Initiative. Then he texted Vanessa, "Want to help with story time at the book Saturday?" Then he scheduled lunch with Thomas to discuss foundation expansion. Then he confirmed dinner at Maya's parents' house, accepting that he'd be nervous and that was okay, that meeting families was always complicated and his was just more dramatic than most. Outside, the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, lights flickering on in windows, people heading home or heading out, the endless circulation of human activity. Marcus watched it all from his small apartment and felt for the first time since his father died 18 years ago like he was exactly where he belonged. Not because the money had solved his problems, it hadn't, but because he was learning to use it as a tool for building the kind of world his father had envisioned. A world where locked refrigerators didn't exist because people chose kindness over cruelty. Where kids aging out of foster care got scholarships instead of homelessness. Where bookstores stayed independent and families went to therapy, and wealth amplified character instead of corrupting it. It was ambitious, probably impossible, definitely messy. But it was his life now, his responsibility, his inheritance in all the ways that mattered. And that, finally, miraculously, felt like enough.